Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. And before we get into today's show, as always, I have to do our little plugs. It keeps the show going, and that is for our Patreon. It's £3 a month. You're going to get a bonus episode every single week. So what it is, it's a Q&A that we do with the guest after the main show. You can submit your questions before or in real time by watching the episode live, which is another perk that you get. You're also going to get access to our Discord server, which we have a beautiful little community that we've built over there. And you also, on the higher tier, get access to our Storytime episodes where myself and Jonas Lorentzen sit down. We've just started Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology, and we're reading through that all the way through and having a little bit of fun with it. We have a beer, we have a laugh. Anybody that's listened to episodes with me and Jonas know kind of how we are. We just kind of have a good time. So if you want to listen to those, and you can listen to the whole back catalogue of those as well anytime you sign up, as well as all the bonus Q&A episodes, you get the whole back catalogue of that. So I don't know how many episodes off the top of my head, but there's a bunch of stuff you can listen to. Like I say, it's £3 a month, and it really does help keep the show going. It helps, keep the editor, keep the people booking the show, keep the social media side going, and helps us grow. So if you can't support obviously financially, then just a 5-star rating or positive review wherever you get your podcast is appreciated, or a simple like, share on Instagram, Facebook. Just helps new people find the podcast, as we're always trying to keep expanding. But to get into today's show, it's Margrethe Havgar's second time on the podcast. I think last time we recorded a record-breaking length for the podcast. I think it was about 3 hours. We sat talking. I got progressively more and more drunk throughout as I, for some reason, kept a bottle of whiskey next to me, and we probably fixed the world, right?
I think so. Why is it still going to shit is my question.
It's got worse. Maybe worse than the world.
I don't know what to say, man. We tried.
Yeah, we did. Maybe we could have just fucked it up. Just blame
Let's
us.
not go down that road.
No, that is a rebel. Okay. Do you want to let people know who you are and what we're going to talk about as well? But if you haven't listened to the first episode, do go back and listen to it. It's one of my all-time favorites. I think we're two kindred spirits in that we just talk very easy. We get on well.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I'm so happy to be back. I actually re-listened to the episode today to make sure that I'm not going to repeat myself too much or like say stuff again that we've already talked about. Which could be fun, of course. But yeah, I'm Margrethe Havgar. I am an archaeologist by education and trade, and right now I'm working as a PhD researcher at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, Norway. So what I'm doing right now is that I'm researching the art of the Oseberg ship burial from the Viking Age, with like a focus on tapestry fragments, so textile fragments that were found in that Viking Age burial, which is quite magnificent considering how like 1,000-year-old textiles usually disintegrate way before we get to them.
Yeah. Before we get into that, can you give a slight overview as to what the Oseberg ship is, or maybe its importance?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the clock here, so to keep it short.
Yeah, we don't have 3 hours this time.
And no, I'm gonna chat. Oh, this is gonna be like a constant battle throughout this entire episode, but I'm gonna really try. So yeah, the Oseberg ship burial is a very kind of uh, unique Viking Age find in a manner of different ways, and it's pretty internationally recognized. Not necessarily that everyone knows about it, but it's fairly famous for a couple of different reasons. And I guess the kind of the most hard-hitting thing is how well preserved it is, considering how old it is. So what it is essentially it is a burial for two people. We know that it's two people because the remains of two biologically female women were found inside of it, and it's composed of a ship that's been pulled from whatever nearby water there was there and dragged onto a field. It's been put in a ditch that's been dug there, and then they've pretty much constructed this pretty gigantic, very much, I would go so far as to use the fairly modern term, extra burial with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they built this huge mound on top of it. So the mound itself is pretty standard when it comes to burial mounds, in the sense that the mound itself is not huge compared to other mounds. It's fairly decent sized, but it's not very small either. And the thing with Oseberg that makes it so recognized is that at the time when it was excavated in 1904, it was extremely well preserved. So, especially here in Norway, the soil is fairly acidic. So what we call kind of like in the archaeological trade, organic materials such as like wood, leather, bodies, textiles, that kind of stuff, it usually decomposes fairly quickly because of the acidity of the soil. But in the area where the Oseberg burial was, which is in around like right outside of Tønsberg at the western side of the Oslofjord, there's a pretty large amount of blue clay in the soil. So what's happened is that when this burial has been constructed in the early or mid 800s AD, is that it's kind of become somewhat akin to like like a like a tin can with food. Like the blue clay has kept it fairly airtight so that it's the organic material has not decomposed at the rate we would suppose that it should normally.
Okay.
And that's why I think it's so famous, both because it's so well preserved, but also because of the amount of stuff, and the quality of the amount of stuff is just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Kim just asked, "What is blue clay?" And I have to piggyback on the back of that.
Absolutely. I can tell you that blue clay is a type of clay that is very thick and it's very moist, and it's good at keeping things airtight. So kind of if anyone's ever heard of or looked up bog bodies, it's not to the extent of that, but it's like akin to that. So it's a very thick sort of clay. That's where my knowledge of exactly what blue clay is ends. But it is a type of clay.
Okay. Yeah. Do we know how much of the ship was underground versus how much was mound?
Yes. We do. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's I can, if we have time for it, or I can find it later if you and I ever
Okay.
have a chat. There are actually very good sketches from the excavation kind of showing exactly how like deep the ditch that they dug for the ship was. So they kind of dug a ditch like a cradle to put the ship in.
Okay.
So I would assume that kind of, if you imagine the ship sitting on water,
Yeah.
it would be a bit less than that, I assume.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, that's like I'm a bit hesitant saying that like with full certainty, but we can look it up.
Mm-hmm. Imagine burying a ship. Like
It's
the
gotta have
effort.
taken so much time. Oh yeah.
Yeah, you really want to bury that ship. It's not like a quick decision. Oh, I'm gonna go bury
No.
a toy outside. I don't know. I think I'm looking at Rocco, so I went with toy. Dogs
Mm-hmm.
burying toy, but it's not like burying something small and somewhat trivial, I guess, and just, oh, I'm gonna dig this up and bury the garden. Like you really want to bury a ship.
Yeah, we're both reading the comment. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yo,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, no, so sorry, Kim. It's just blue clay. Yeah, it's just it's a form, it's a version of clay. It's kind of particular for being so airtight. So
Okay.
it is a type
Okay.
of clay, like any other clay. It's just a variation of a type of clay.
Mm-hmm. Is it blue?
No,
Do we
it's
know
more
it?
like dark brown. It might have bluish tinges. I don't actually remember. I have actually worked at an excavation with a ridiculous amount of blue clay here in the harbor of Oslo, which gave me chronic tendonitis in both wrists. So that was fun. It is hard
Mm-hmm.
packed as fuck.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, anyone who's played in clay as a kid just knows how dense it is. I'm guessing it's just like a denser version of that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, I guess it did its job in preserving what was needed.
100%. It 100% did.
So okay, so we know what the Oseberg ship is now. I guess now, what makes it so special? I guess from an art perspective, because I think most people who've Googled Viking art, you see like I think it's the seven different types of art, and the Oseberg is usually defined as its own type of art. Now, I have a good friend in Luciano who's been on the podcast a bunch of times, who every time anybody mentions the Oseberg as a type of art, messages me on Instagram screaming, "It's not a fucking type of art." He doesn't believe he doesn't think it's like a well, not that it's not a type of art, but I think he doesn't
No, no,
clarify it
but
as
no,
like one
no.
of the periods of Viking Age art. He doesn't kind of put it as that like the Bora, the Ringerike. Like he doesn't put it in one of those little boxes. But obviously most people do kind of classify it like that. So I always get it in the neck from him. So I have to kind of throw this out there so you can clarify it.
I think I am I think what happened was that there was such a big concentration of especially wooden, like carved wooden stuff of various types in the Oseberg burial that it ended up kind of being referred to as its own art style because all of this was like it is pretty much a time capsule, right? Because all of this stuff was put
Mm-hmm.
in that place at the same time and then they sealed it up. Um
Yeah.
but uh I'm on the it's not its own style part here, and there's been a lot of research done kind of highlighting the fact that even though it's all of these things ended up at the same place at the same time doesn't mean that it's all part of the same style. So like
Mm-hmm.
if you compare it to uh Borre or Ringerike or those different types of styles, one thing that stands out a bit with what's referred to as the Oseberg style is that every type of style has variation, but uh, Oseberg has too much variation, I would say, to be classified as a style, and there aren't really that many examples of something that can be called Oseberg outside of the Osebergs. I would rather say that Oseberg is a collection of a bunch of different styles put in the same place at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. I don't know if that
Okay.
became kind of too highbrow there for a second, but
No, no, no. It makes complete sense. But then I think that opens up a whole interesting question in why, as in like why does this one place have this one specific? If it's not its own style of art, I guess that was renowned everywhere. But there are multiple pieces in this kind of style. So,
well, that's the thing.
what
Well,
do you
that's
think
the
the
thing
reason
that I
would
think
be that
is
it would end?
I think it's cool that here we're getting into a really technical aspect of the art of the burial, but I think that um the different now we're talking specifically about the carved wooden stuff um is similar, but it's not identical. So one reason why a lot of similar things that very well could be the same style has ended up in the same place at the same time without necessarily being kind of this is the starting point of a whole new style, is because it's from the area. But then also
Hmm.
that area having been in touch with other places and other styles, and like you can kind of I guess you can kind of compare it to interior design a little bit. Like at
Hmm.
some point you had like there was major art deco going on, and then you had kind of what you could call like the Scandinavian style much later, but also you had postmodern and everything. But at the same time, you can also have all these different styles happening at once. And at some person's house, it's more Art Deco-y, and at another person's place, it's more
Hmm.
Scandinavian. And someone else has blended them.
So I guess so. It's more of a local variation on wider styles. Would
Yeah.
that be correct?
So I guess I could kind of, if this makes sense. Again, this might get technical, so please stop me and ask me to clarify. But I did my
No, no,
master's
it's all right.
thesis specifically on the ship, and the ship was
Okay.
where like my passion for this burial started. Because what makes the ship cool is that we have mentions of decorated ships in sagas, and we also have ships that seem to be decorated on, for example, the Gotlandic picture stones. But so far, the only physical ship from the Viking Age that we have, a ship that is actually a ship, like big enough to sail in with decoration, is the Oseberg. It is the one, period.
Okay. Hmm.
And what I kind of argued in my master's thesis was that the ship is, if you're going into the very technical aspect of like the art styles, it's stylistically similar to two other wooden carved objects in the burial, and that is one of the animal head posts. Again, I can show pictures of this later if you guys want,
Hmm.
because it's kind of hard to visualize all of this. But the third is what's called a sled shaft, so like the thing that would pull the sled.
Okay.
Um, and those three belong to the very dry style type, I argue, called Celine's style 3E, which is a very, very
Okay.
early style, fairly early. Please
Hmm.
don't come for me, people who are style experts. I know that there are several styles before Celine's style 3.
So okay, so the the kind of idea of like the Oseberg style, is that based just on the decoration of the physical ship itself and not the goods found within? Other than you
No,
said that
it's
there's
based
just
on all
two
of the
items
goods.
that are similar.
It's based on all of the
Oh,
goods. So
okay.
what I think has happened is, also I want to clarify, I don't think the people who originally did this research did a bad job. I just think that this is how research works, right? So things progress. So people put out
Mhm.
one theory, and then people, snooty people like me, come along and go,
It's very diplomatic of you.
thank you. I like erring on the side of diplomacy, and then we'll go from there. But I think what's happened is that there was such a big concentration of very similar decorated pieces in this one place, and like the amount of decorated stuff is just, again, just so like mind blowing. And due to the fact that it is similar, but then is also a bit different from other styles that were known of, and at this point in the early 1900s, they knew of several styles. This is not a new thing, but I don't think it's weird that the original researchers ended up kind of proposing an Oseberg style. But when you dig deeper into
Yeah.
the specific different pieces, that hypothesis doesn't hold up. So I think it's cooler to kind of think of it as like a, a crock pot, where a bunch of different elements of several contemporaneous, so like several styles existing at the same time, ended up. So we can see that kind of like, I would
Okay.
argue that it more shows a way of like, it's not that they used this style and then they stopped, or like then this style came along and then they 100% switched to the other one. I think it kind of more shows a gradual progression between styles, but then also that different styles existed at once. And we're not talking about like huge differences here. It's like, how curved is that thing? Or how bulbous is that
Yeah.
body? We're, you know,
Mm. But I think that's one thing that we all probably forget at some point is that everything wasn't cut and dry. It's there is a transition period between everything, but it's we all look for like these little boxes to put stuff in, whether it's the art styles or when certain runes were used, when the Elder Futhark was used, when the young like people want this box of like it was used between this year, and it's as if like they just stopped and then started with the new thing. And it's not. There's a huge transition period with everything. So you're gonna get these blurred lines, and some areas are gonna be probably transitions quicker than others, and you're gonna get this kind of
yeah, I mean,
nice fluid
it,
mix, which I think is beautiful that you get.
it is beautiful. And it's like, I guess you can kind of compare it to phones. It's like, even though there's a newer iPhone model out, I still have this iPhone.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
necessarily, it's that comparison isn't necessarily valid in all points, but you can kind of make that argument that even though there is progression onto something new, that doesn't mean that the other thing just stops full stop. And I think that that's a very cool point that you just made with the whole like we want it in clear boxes, and that's what I think is so fun being an archaeologist and a researcher. It's like getting having this like continuously have being in this kind of point of contention where we've been taught that history is this thing, and then the Stone Age lasted from this point to this point, and then people migrated
Mm-hmm.
from Africa. Like just on July 1st, 150,000 years ago, everyone decided to leave. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
pulling those dates out of my ass, by the way. Um, but at the same time, like that's what we've been taught, right? So the periods last from this long, and they did this at that point, and then they switched to this thing. But the thing is that if there's anything I've learned from both studying archaeology and being an archaeologist out in the field and also doing research, is that the whole world, but also humans specifically, have always been and are still very messy. And not messy in a bad
Oh
way,
yeah.
but kind of
Mm-hmm.
we
I
don't
mean,
always make the rational choice. We don't always want to do what's best for us.
yeah. Well, I think every person listening to this can relate to that.
Mm-hmm. And even
Uh, I,
so, we
I
make
have,
awesome stuff.
yeah, absolutely. I have four very good friends. Uh, and I struggle getting them to all come together and do a single thing. We can plan it months in advance, and it's a nightmare trying to get just five guys together in a single place with like a couple of hours free to just hang out. So I can't imagine trying to mobilize a group of 100
Mm-hmm.
people or 1,000 people to do anything. It has to. Everything is like you say, it's messy and takes time.
And I think that's wonderful because that means that there's always something new to figure out or understand. And
Mm-hmm.
the Oseberg burial itself is a very clear-cut example of people at some point having a very different experience with the world that we occupy today, but the world, the way they saw it and the way that they interacted with it was just mind-blowingly different from anything we can imagine today. And I think that that's
Mm-hmm.
so cool. So like no matter this might sound like a Debbie Downer thing, but to me it's a point of sincere excitement that no matter how many years I spend on this, no matter how much work I put into this, I will probably never understand exactly how these art styles come together or exactly what they were meant to communicate to the people who saw them at the time when it was made because I wasn't raised with that mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I, I always wonder, like, but would you want to know if somebody could say, like, the snap of her fingers, you could just unlock everything? Do you think you would want to, or is part of the beauty in? not knowing and being able to hypothesize?
Uh, yes and no. Because I think that even if
Oh no, no,
someone
you can't
could.
sit on the fence. You have to pick one.
No, no, okay.
You
All
have to
right.
pick
So
yes
I
or no.
no, okay. I'm gonna go oh, wow. I have to pick one. Well, you know what? I am too curious and I've always been
Yeah.
interested in time travel, so I would go with yes, but I think that even so, it would also then take someone with extreme like neurological understanding of also linguistics and cultural kind of understanding to
Okay.
give me that snapshot, because even if they told me like exactly what these things mean, I would also then have to be able to know if someone showed me a picture of a horse, everything a horse could potentially mean for a person from
Mhm.
not just the Viking Age, but from that specific area and that specific time period.
I see what you're doing here to edge yourself back onto that fence.
Erring on the side of
Yeah, I get it.
diplomacy.
Oh, yeah,
No, but
exactly.
I
No,
would
I,
100% want to know
I,
all the answers. Yes. Yes,
mhm,
100%. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, I think I've said it for the last few weeks, so we can't go into it again. But just I'd love to know what we've got wrong. I think that would fascinate me almost more than learning like what's true. I would love to know um things that we hold in really high esteem that actually just meant shit. Like I would love to know that, like something that we found and go, oh my god, this is absolutely this, and just across all of human history, not just the Viking Age, across it all. I would love just to know what we really got wrong,
Yeah, or just like
and then
for
watch the people
example,
crumble.
like exactly. Or not just stuff that we got wrong, but stuff that we misunderstood. So, for example, like one
Yeah.
specific type of image or one specific way of doing things. Like, for example, mounds being a symbol of power. Like, so constructing a mound is a clear symbol of power. Um, that is a very like hot topic that you can discuss
Mm-hmm.
until the cows come home. And there's absolutely 100% merit to that, I would say. But also, just I wonder if, for example, that thing would be more like, well, sure, mounds can be construction, or like constructing mounds can be a show of power. But then, like, if you asked a contemporaneous person from the Viking Age, being like, well, you're missing the point. If that's kind of thing, well,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, sure, but actually, and then whatever answer that would be, just be like, it's not that
Yeah,
we
yeah, yeah.
necessarily got it wrong, but we're focusing on the wrong thing, or like we're focusing on the thing that isn't
Mhm.
like the point, us.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I'm sure we do it a lot. Okay, let's get back on topic before we do end up here for 3 hours again. You're particularly looking at the textiles now. What I guess what can they unlock for us? And also, do you see this art style, quote, not art style, appearing in textiles as well, or is it just to like the non-textile items?
Okay, so
I was trying to think of a
uh
way to put it without.
stuff that isn't textile, yes. um
Yeah.
I'm a do kind of like a roundabout way into that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay.
So um I'm gonna start with making fun of myself, essentially. Where when I was doing my master's, I was really interested at looking at all of the art from the burial. But I was like, oh, the textiles are a bit much. But like everything else I'd want to do. Because like all the textiles are like a whole thing and I don't want to get into it. Haha me. Uh and just
Mm-hmm.
before my master's thesis, I didn't have the space or the time. And then so that was kind of like a dream of mine to do like an analysis of all of the art. And then a couple of years after my master's, there's suddenly a PhD position, where there is suddenly here in Oslo a newly funded, very exclusively kind of textile based research project that came out specifically aimed at the Oseberg textiles. And I was like, whoa, this might be my shot. And I was like, all right, but I want
Mhm.
to work with Oseberg, so I'm fine with like the textiles. But at the same time, when I was kind of applying for this, I was like, ooh, I don't really know anything about textiles. I don't really know any, like, I know something about
Mhm.
these textiles, but not a lot. But my angle into it then was kind of arguing the fact that when you look at the Oseberg burial, especially the art stuff, they talk about like the burial, but the burial doesn't include the textiles kind of when you talk about the art. Like, so they talk about all of the art, and then some other people talk about all of the textiles, and they're kind of two
Mhm.
separate camps that know about each other but don't really interact.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess the art's so beautiful in a sense of like the ship itself, the beast heads you mentioned before, the sleds. It's very overwhelmingly well. It's just astonishing these pieces have been made, and then the textiles, I guess, kind of just get left behind because for the layperson, the significance probably gets missed a little bit. I know when I went to see the Oseberg ship, there was like a little room, I guess, for the light where the textile pieces were kept, or certain ones that were on show. And most people walked straight past it. Now I went in and had a look, but it's not these little pieces of fabric don't hold the same kind of gravitas as these beautiful wooden carvings that you can kind of that are overwhelming. So I think that's probably
Mm-hmm.
maybe why they're separate, even though the fact we have these textiles and they've remained and not disintegrated is amazing in itself.
I think that you are right, but I think that the reason you are right is partially to the original research is partially to blame for that being the case.
Okay.
Because I would argue that the textiles aren't any less awe inspiring, but there is a very long and difficult history with publishing the entire find, and also with the, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus here, but some specific researchers who worked on the textiles, and for varying reasons, the textiles ended up not being, what should I call it, appropriately published until 2006.
Okay.
This
Okay.
was excavated in 1904.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think that the reason why kind of the textiles have been somewhat left behind is both because of the original publications that wanted to give its own volume to the textiles. That was the plan from the get-go. And I've just literally last week was able to verify that piece of information because I spent 2 days straight in the archive of the museum just like digging through papers. But that
Okay.
volume, which is sat right behind me right here, didn't come out until 2006 because of a number of reasons, not because anyone necessarily shit the bed. Several people 100% shit the bed. But that kind of meant that the original publication of the Oseberg burial came out in 5 consecutive volumes, this being the fourth, between
Mhm.
1917 and 1934. I might be a bit off on that last date, but so the volumes one, two, three, and five came out in that time span, and then almost a century later, you get the last piece. Um, and
Okay.
I think that's kind of also how I think that's manifested in the way that the find's been communicated and talked about, and also I think a very unfortunate situation with the Oseberg textiles, and I think a lot of other textile finds as well, is that it's kind of been um, given over to like the textile people. And I say this with quotation marks. And what I mean by that is
Mm-hmm.
wonderful, magnificent researchers who do a fantastic job, but then people outside of that sphere are perhaps a bit unconsciously and then sometimes very on face value, a bit like, whatever. Like you can see
Mm-hmm.
this in, and here I might go off on a tangent and I'm still looking at a clock, but I think this is very valuable because also, again, I want to give myself like the reverse credit where credit is due. I want to very upfront criticize myself for this because I was a part of this. That to this day, textile research is very much seen as like a woman thing, like a girl thing.
Okay.
That is not the
Okay.
case 100% of the time, but as to an astonishingly large amount, which was baffling to me
Mm-hmm.
when I started. I didn't really realize, but then I realized as I started getting kind of flabbergasted by this that I myself sat with that prejudice. That I also was a bit like,
Mm-hmm.
ugh, I don't want to go into textiles because it's like a girl thing. And I don't want to be, I was
Okay.
like, not like other girls, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
But do you think that that's because textiles in general have always been associated typically with women? I know at
I think
school
so.
when
Yeah.
you could pick technology like a technology subject at school, you could do like metal, woodworking or textiles, and it was like all the boys were choosing wood and metal, and all the girls were choosing textiles. It was just kind of a thing.
I think that it's a stereotype that goes back a long way, and I don't think we've really done much to change that stereotype. Like you wouldn't
Mhm.
really, I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but if you're at like a lecture or a talk, you wouldn't really necessarily do a double take if you see like a woman or a girl sitting there knitting, but you might do a double take if you see like a middle-aged man sitting there knitting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's isn't that kind of
Okay.
weird? Like why? Why does that warrant a
Mhm.
double take?
It shouldn't. No, it shouldn't. But I think we're certainly moving in the right direction with a lot of this stuff. And
Yeah.
as I guess as we mentioned earlier, things don't just happen
Mm-mm.
overnight. As much as most of us would love things to just happen overnight and change to happen kind of in an instance, these things do unfortunately take time. It takes generations of people updating their ideology until we get to a more progressive place through kind of just
100%.
time and it. So soon I'll be able to knit peacefully on the train.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. But that also kind of like uh added to my already pretty fueled fire of wanting to look at the art as a whole. Now, whether to what degree I'll be able to do that, I don't know, but I've so far kind of I love to do everything, but the funding only lasts for so long, right? But
Mm-hmm.
now initially I'm gonna look at everything that has what I call figures on them. So clear cut figures of some sort of creature or human or animal and stuff like that. And that's where the textiles and everything else in so the wood, the metal, there's a bit of metal, not too much, but some. But specifically like the
Mm-hmm.
two main categories of what you could also call decorated items of the Oseberg barrel is wooden artifacts and textile artifacts. And
Mm-hmm.
to
How,
answer
how
your,
much?
hmm?
No, no, go on. Finish what you're saying. Sorry.
I just kind of realized that I never really answered your initial question of those art styles and the textiles. That's that's where this also gets really interesting because the art styles on the textiles are, I wouldn't say vastly different from the wooden artifact specifically, but the way that they appear is not the same. It is
Okay.
it is a very different way of portraying what you're trying to portray, and I think that as much as that may harken to different styles specifically, I also think that we might also here be talking about the different ways of treating different types of material. So when you're working with wood,
Hmm.
it's vastly different from when you're weaving on a loom.
Yeah, of course. You can use different techniques. I guess you can get 3D with wood carving, whereas you can't really do that with textiles.
Yeah, and the way that it appears is different. The way that it kind of gives off or shades lighting is different. You can like
Mhm.
I think color comes into play a lot quicker with textiles.
Yeah.
Not that it doesn't come into play
Mhm.
with wood at all, but it most of the case, unless you're working within kind of like a monochrome or using different types of wood in the same thing, you're more than talking about like when you're actually sitting with the object, you're talking about lights and like the depth of field and
Mhm.
everything. And then if you want to add color, you paint it afterwards or you use tar or whatever. But with
Mhm.
textiles, if you want color in the textiles without it being kind of uh, funky looking, the easiest way to do that is to use different types of dyed yarn and
Yeah.
thread.
Do, you might. I assume you would know this. Do we know if any of the objects from those spaceship were painted?
There is one that we know of from for a fact. Exactly how it was painted is hard to say because of the way that the paint kind of just faded almost immediately from what I've been able to
Hmm.
tell. But there is a chair from the burial that I actually don't know whether or not I'll be able to conclude or include in my material yet because I haven't found any figures on it yet. But there's a chair that very specifically is documented to have had paint traces, but you can't see it today. And it
Yeah.
seems
Hmm.
from the notes that were taking at the time when the paint was visible that they weren't necessarily able to conclude exactly what colors they were seeing either, but more kind of within types of hue. So yeah, it does
Hmm.
seem that paint was involved, but as far as I know, especially like the ship doesn't seem to have been any paint traces on the ship.
Hmm. No, I imagine a ship, especially one that's a functional ship, would probably be pointless. But I do think it's something that most people forget or don't realize that a lot of items were
Mm-hmm.
painted. I went to the Royal Armories, which is a museum in Leeds, where basically it's a collection of. I think it came from the Tower of London. It's a collection of armaments from the medieval period that was kept in a vault in London, and they decided to put them on display. And there's a stunning piece of armor. And I was looking up for a gentleman that works there to show me around, and there was a piece of armor that was originally blue and gold. Now it looks, you can see the gold, but the rest of it just looks like your typical steel color. But apparently, in between the joints, there is, when you articulate the joints, you can still see traces of this like really vibrant blue of what this armor would have looked like, and there's a nice little picture next to it, and it completely changes the feel of it. I think of this like blue and gold armor, very kind of a regal and royal, I imagine, versus just a kind of typical steel.
100%. And I mean, there's another, it's not Oseberg, but there is another uh find very close in timeline. The Goksta ship was which is from a bit further south, from where Oseberg was found, which is from the early 900s AD. So the century afterwards, where there were a bunch of shields kind of mounted along the lines. So this is also a ship burial along the lines of the ship that were alternately yellow and black,
Okay, like a
black and yellow,
bumblebee,
black and yellow. Yep.
or like Wiz Khalifa. Yeah, could go there as well.
Yeah. But so I think paint was
That
definitely
is Wiz
involved,
Khalifa,
but
right?
I think so. Pretty sure.
Well, let's go with it.
Yeah, well, let's
I'm
go
pretty
with it.
sure it is.
People can rag at us
I'm
in the
showing my
comments.
knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um. Go on, sorry, what were you saying?
No, but just like paint, yeah, I think paint was definitely involved, and I just think it like unfortunately, paint is also one of those things that is very hard for us to locate unless you look for it specifically, and
Mm-hmm.
then if you try to test for it, you also know have to. This is not my area of expertise, so I don't know what tests you would do, but you have to know also kind of what dyes they would have used. So if you do chemical analyses, you have to know which kind of type of chemical makeups you're looking for. So you wouldn't necessarily be looking for the paint, but you'd be looking for the ingredients. So you'd have to know what
Yeah.
ingredients were used and that type of thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's something that's being done for the textiles of the Oseberg ship as we speak. That they want to see whether or not they can find traces of the paint. So at the moment, the fragments look fairly brownish, depending on which tapestry fragment you're looking at. But there were. It's hard to know exactly what colors were involved, but likely very many colors. So probably very vibrant.
So okay, so back to just the textiles. How much do we have? Because I know again when I was with ACT, I only saw what was on public display, and it didn't seem like much.
So I think how much we have, that quantity is also very dependent on what type of scale we're talking about. So
Okay.
if we're talking about Viking age textiles, we have approximately a shit ton because we don't have a lot of textiles from the Viking age. If you're talking about textiles in general, it's not that much, but we're not talking a couple of fragments. Giving a precise number of exactly how much textiles we do have from the Oseberg burial is a bit challenging because it depends on how you count them. Because all of this, I would love to just show you kind of neat, big pieces of fabric, but it's just fragmented into literally hundreds of pieces. So, like what I call the tapestry fragments, I want to also clarify because this is something I recently learned that also tapestry doesn't necessarily indicate something that's being hung on a wall, but it indicates a type of textile production and something that's been made with imagery. So it's telling a story, kind of like the Bayeux tapestry, which was supposed like very clearly intended to hang on walls, but a tapestry fragment doesn't necessarily have to indicate that it must have hung on a wall. And interestingly, in Oseberg, there is nothing indicating that these pieces have been hung on walls.
Do we know what the pieces are? Are they items? Because I just assumed they would be items of clothing, or are they like wall hangings or blankets?
That's a really good question. That's actually something I'm working closely with my supervisor, who is one of the ones who worked the most on these textiles before me. Marianne Federer, shout out. She's done amazing stuff. In cooperation with a really wonderful team up at NTNU, which is another university here that does a lot of like computer AI and color analysis stuff. So it is a bit challenging to kind of pin down exactly what these tapestry fragments have been specifically because of how small they are, and also because so callback. Do you remember last time, Dan, that we talked about this whole break-in thing about mounds and how people broke into mounds and stuff?
Yeah, I think that was before I had too much whiskey. That was
honestly also
that was pre-whiskey, I think.
Yeah, but also sidetrack. I having kind of re-listened to that episode today. You mentioned that you're drinking whiskey, but you don't really sound as drunk as you make yourself out to have been. Maybe it felt different, but it didn't seem that way.
Good. Towards the end of it, there was definitely two of you on the screen. Put it that way.
I love it. But yeah, last time we talked about like this whole notion of haugbrot, or literally breaking the mound, and that this has happened to a lot of different burial mounds, Oseberg included. And what's interesting with the break-in, again, I want to clarify that the whole what was the break-in for and who did it and was it positive or was it negative is very much up for debate. But what's interesting with that whole thing that happened in Oseberg is that they saw that this had happened when they excavated burial, and they were able to follow the tunnel that these people had dug into the burial. And this had happened during the mid 900s. So we approximate that the Oseberg burial happened in 834 AD. So approximately like 120 years ish after the mound was built, someone dug their way into the burial. And the tunnel that we have very clear evidence of from the excavation kind of almost ish goes in a straight line directly into the burial chamber. And then they
Okay.
kind of make an entranceway into the burial chamber. And I got ahead of myself here a little bit because there's something I forgot to clarify. So the Oseberg burial consists of a ship, like I mentioned, and then you have a mast, and then behind that mast, they've built what we refer to as a chamber. You can imagine it kind of like a wooden tent. So like a
Mm-hmm.
solid room built of wood. And that's where we
Yeah.
think these two women were originally placed. Interestingly, the body parts that remained of them were found right outside the burial chamber in that break in tunnel. So these people had, for some reason, extracted or kind of lifted out the bodies. And for some reason, parts of them then ended up in this tunnel. Don't ask me why. I don't know. This is a thing that I'm currently trying to wrap my head around exactly why this happened. But
Could
all
it
of,
be? Sorry, I was say, did they leave the tunnel open? Because maybe could it be like wild animals?
I don't think so. That is a good guess, I'd say. Um, but I would then expected to have found more remains of animals and also more remains of animals in the burial chamber, which there are none of as far as I know. So I
Well,
don't know.
I was more meaning like animals coming in after
Yeah,
the robbery and
yeah, yeah, no.
and taking the bones.
I don't think so because there is a bit of an I mean, it depends on what animals you're talking about here, but we don't really have like mountain lions in those parts of Norway. But there
Mm-hmm.
is a bit. So if you imagine, kind of, for those of you listening and not looking, um, uh, if you kind of imagine the tunnel going a bit, I'm trying to find an example here. Um, so imagine that you're standing on a pier and you're looking down into a boat, and there is a bit of a height difference there.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and from the entrance into the burial chamber that these people created, so they kind of they chopped off of pieces of wood in what would be the ceiling slash wall of the chamber. I think
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is without me having done any kind of factual research into this. I would assume that it would require an animal larger than a rodent to be able to get those bones from inside the burial chamber, which would be the height of this fictional boat we're talking about, into that
Okay.
tunnel or the pier that we're imagining we're
Mm-hmm.
standing on.
So did they get that tunnel bang on into the burial chamber? As in,
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
because that. So did they get the tunnel that they made to rob the grave? Did they get that tunnel straight into the burial chamber like
Pretty
first
much.
go?
Pretty much.
Because that's that
Uh,
I feel like that takes some skill or some prior knowledge of the mound because obviously
they
it's a
know
decent
exactly where
sized
they're
ship.
going.
Yeah, to hit the little burial chamber is quite impressive.
And the reason we know this is point one, because we can follow the tunnel, and point two, because nothing else in the burial has been disturbed. So the way that the things
Mm-hmm.
were kind of
Okay, yeah.
arranged seemed very intentional, but then you get into the burial chamber. And from what I can understand from the documentation from the excavation, it's pretty much a clusterfuck. Now, it should be, I'm throwing in a bunch of details here, but it should also be mentioned that the 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 mound has also collapsed at some point, like inwardly. So you have that added difficulty. So things are a bit more smushed than they would have been originally.
Okay.
And that's for the whole burial. But even with that taken into consideration, the chaoticness of the burial chamber is very different from the rest of the ship. And the reason then why some of these tapestry and textile pieces are hard to figure out exactly what they were originally is because all of these pieces were found in the burial chamber. And we don't know why they've been fragmented. We don't know when specifically it happened. I don't think necessarily people have thrown or like torn things apart, but the fabrics have ended up crumpled or buried in a manner that when they were excavated, they were so fragile that it was hard to separate them without destroying them further. So it's like if you all right.
So you had,
I have a sweater here. It's like
yeah.
This is the sweater, right? But then if it then ends up like this for a certain amount of time and it hardens and crystallizes,
like how teenage boys put how a teenage boy puts his clothes on the floor.
Yeah, how a teenage boy puts his clothes on the floor. But also, if you like fold it fairly neatly, it's also hard to unfold it without kind of damaging it further. And unfortunately, exactly which pieces were found where in the burial chamber, that's where the documentation from this excavation is lacking. And here I'm being very reasonable.
Okay. So it could have been that these pieces were just because I imagine clothing was deemed a luxury, particularly a very nice ornate piece of clothing. So it could be that these bits of textiles belonged to either one of these two ladies that are buried there.
100%.
I guess these could maybe have been they could have just been folded and put in there like any other grave good.
Could have been clothes, could have been cloaks, could have been any sort of textile that could have been carpets for the floor, could have been cushion covers, could have been like. So there's actually, interestingly, as far as I can tell, again, that's why it's kind of fun recording this episode with you now, and it would be fun to come back later and kind of maybe retract some of the stuff that I say now. But this is ongoing research, right? So I don't know where I'm going to end up, but at this point, I'm fairly certain that there's no evidence of a bed in the burial chamber of Oseberg. There are several beds from the burial, but they're not found in the chamber. Don't ask me why. But there is another shit ton of material we have from the burial chamber specifically, in addition to the textiles, and that is a shit ton of down, feathers. So my supervisor has a fairly interesting theory that I'm working with right now, that all of that down might be traces of a mattress, kind of like a mattress that you bring when you're going camping, if you're going glamping or something. And that maybe these two women were originally placed on a mattress. And then maybe some of these tapestry pieces are part of either a coverlet like a bed sheet or a bedspread.
Yeah, it makes complete sense, because if you, certainly for me, and I'm looking through it, I'm looking at it through modern eyes. You add textiles to make things feel comfortable, and if you're making this burial mound for these two people, whether it's one of them was in high standing and the other one is placed with them because it's a servant, or because they're both in high standing for whatever reason, there's clear some importance to one or both of these people, then it would be made comfortable. You would obviously put beautiful objects of like gold,
You want to
jewels,
make it
wooden,
homey, right?
but you'd also make it nice and cozy. Yeah, and therefore you would put like a bed, like I've just been decorating my living room. I put a bunch of throws and cushions and things to make that kind of cozy feel. So when I'm sat there watching a scary film, I've got something to hide behind.
Exactly. And it's like, I mean, burials and funerals occur very differently today than they did back then. And also today, social standing is very much a thing when it comes to how much you can afford when it comes to a burial. But the way that the burial presents itself, besides the tombstone after the fact, isn't necessarily like, besides the tombstone, there is not necessarily an indication of social standing today, I would postulate. But at the same time, you can kind of, I'm pulling this from personal experience too. My grandmother passed away this summer. And like you said, with like the whole cozy, comfy, like showing respect thing also, like I remember there was a very um comforting discussion between my dad and his brothers where they honestly had a discussion of kind of, what do we think mom would want to be buried in? And
Mm-hmm.
there you have that aspect of, so today
It
it's a much more pared
it
down,
is.
but they still wanted like, what would mom want to wear? And then you
Mm-hmm.
could maybe speculate that it was the same thing, not necessarily what specifically would these women have wanted to wear or something, but that there was an effort made to make this a
Mm-hmm.
home after their life had ended
Yeah.
here, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think we have a disattachment to clothing in particular that they wouldn't have had back then because we live in an era of fast fashion. Whether you fall victim to just buying things off ASOS or you do try and look after and upcycle your clothing, I think we still all fall into that thing of we can just buy something quickly. We're not having to make it ourselves. It's produced very fast in comparison. So we just have this idea of clothing being kind of um throwawayable is not the word I'm looking for. There's a
Yeah,
better word.
it's expendable
But we
to a
just have
much
this
larger degree.
expendable. There you go. Thank you for pulling me out of that one. But obviously back then it wasn't. These items took a long time to make. They were repaired if they were you got a hole in. So to bury somebody with it is kind of like burying them with any expensive item. It's a show of respect, I guess, and that journey onto the next life, possibly.
Yeah, and I think that that's why I'm so grateful to be able to do this project, because the more you bear that in mind, then to me at least, it becomes more and more clear that the textiles are just as much a part of the overall art happening here. Because if you think about
Mm-hmm.
the the labor and effort and expense it takes to make all of these carved objects, there is no less of an investment in the production time and the effort and the expense made in producing these textiles. It depends, of course, on what
Mm-hmm.
material you're talking about, but with the wood, you have to make sure you have the right type of wood, that you have the right people doing it, how long it takes to carve, that you have the right tools. And with the fabrics, it's like you have to have the right sheep, it needs to be shorn, the yarn needs to be spun, it needs to be dyed, the yarn needs to be spun in the right thickness. And like the amount of time it requires to make a very crappy piece of fabric is
Mm-hmm.
mind blowing
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah, that you know what, you hit the nail on the head because that's one thing I completely didn't realize until I saw somebody spinning yarn to make or spinning wool to make like a yarn or whatever, like I know the technical word for it,
A
like a piece
thread.
of fabric, yeah, like a thread of fabric. I never, I guess it's just I never thought about it. It was just
Me
never a
neither.
thing that came into my mind. So I just assumed these looms of fabric existed somewhere. And then when I saw somebody like spinning like bits of wool to make the each individual like line or piece of fabric, I was like, oh my god, that takes time. So you're not only making the garment or the piece, whatever it's going to end up to be, you have to make the thing before, you have to make the actual yarn before you can even make the item.
Exactly. And I think that that's why, so I want to address the thing that I said earlier about like textiles being looked at as a woman thing. And I don't think that anything being looked at as a woman thing is a bad thing. A thing being a woman thing is not inherently a bad thing. The bad thing, if something is deemed a woman thing, comes from the prerequisite notion culturally of something being less than. So if something is a woman
Mm-hmm.
thing, it is less interesting. It is less worthy of appreciation, or not necessarily appreciation. Like, yeah, I really enjoyed this sweater my mom did knit, but like this sweater my mom knitted, I really appreciated. But I'm also talking about the amount of effort and expense. And I think that that's where it's really interesting, kind of. And there's a lot of people working on this of all genders when it comes to textile research, of several different geographical areas and time periods, of just being careful not to unconsciously deeming something a woman thing and then therefore not being an important cultural aspect. Because I think if we want to make it kind of coarse, you could say that if you take all of that time and effort and expense when it comes to both manual labor and uh, creation of like livestock and sharing and all that stuff, and the time required for the right sheep to have the right amount of wool. If you want to make it a bit kind of coarse and crude, you could say that if you take all that into account, it becomes very obvious, to me at least, at a very early point, that this must have been a massive part of any culture's economy. And I'm not talking about hard coin here, but I'm
Oh
talking
yeah.
about just making the society, however large or small, function, because people needed clothing. They needed to not freeze, or they needed to be
Mm-hmm.
shaded from the
Especially
sun.
Mhm. Especially in a cold country like Norway. Um, yeah, you would have been very grateful for textiles.
100%.
Okay, is there anything we need to know before we wrap up? Because otherwise we are gonna just keep going.
Well, I
uh,
could do like a little,
is there anything we desperately need to know?
I could do a shameless little plug for coming back a third time.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely welcome. So yeah, please do that. Yeah.
uh,
So anything we need to know before you further research, and then you can come back and update us at a later date.
I think anything we absolutely need to know is that there are a lot of narratives that have been very hardly kind of cemented about what the Oseberg ship is and what it does and who these women were, that I think um, is not as clear cut as it seems to be. That might be a very bland answer, but what I mean by that is to say that even though we know a lot about this find and it's been worked on a lot and a lot of people have had a lot of interesting thoughts about it, it doesn't mean that we're done.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm sure there's so much more we can learn, and so much more you're gonna learn and teach us about.
Yeah.
That's it.
So
Okay. Go on.
no, I was just gonna say this shameless plug, which was kind of what I originally thought we would spend the most time on, but that I haven't even touched on yet because we're us and we talk about so many interesting things for forever. Is
Mm-hmm.
that a really cool part of the project that I'm working on right now that kind of happened organically that I wasn't intending to do is that I've been working on new illustrations of these tapestry fragments. And that's really cool because the type, I'm not, again, I'm not a textile expert and I'm not kind of learned in illustration or anything either, but we've never had digital illustrations of the tapestry fragments that I'm currently doing. So that's something that I'd love to
Mm-hmm.
come back and talk more about and show because it's really cool.
Okay. We will book that in, and you can come back, and we'll. I'll free out the whole evening so we can discuss it for as long as we need.
like start like have like a Patreon episode where like we start recording at 5 in the afternoon and then
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's wrap this up, and then we're gonna carry on the Q&A. So if people do want to carry on listening, there is going to be a little bit more to this episode over on the Q&A. And that's the one thing I didn't mention at the start, was that the Q&As tend to be just an extension of the main show. We usually have like a 5-minute break, and then I have a bunch of questions that I didn't ask in the main show that I probably had in the back of my mind, but just forgot about and remember in that break. So, the Q&As aren't just a specific Q&A format. They do have a kind of just an extension of the main show. So if you do want to listen to this one and all the other ones, you can just pop onto the Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. And like I say, it's £3 a month, which works out about 10p a day. And it does kind of help the shows keep going. Margaret, where can people find you if you want people to find you?
So I am mostly active on Instagram currently, and that is Archeomags, Archeo with a K, so ARKEO, Mags, MAGS at Instagram.
Perfect. If you want to follow me, it's Daniel_Farrand1. I'm starting to get back into posting my little history videos, which I like doing. So
I
there's
know,
gonna
I
be a
love
bunch
them.
more of those. There's gonna be a bunch more of those coming. They're gonna be done from this lovely spot here, and I'm gonna cover some topics that I want to know the answer to. So I'm gonna do things like, what is the Doomsday Book? What is the Magna Carta? Things that people have heard of, but probably aren't too sure what they exactly are. I guess if you want to follow the business, it's Horns of Odin. Obviously, that's always very much appreciated. And just the podcast on all the different platforms, just Nordic Mythology Podcast. So let's jump over and do Q&A, because I know there'll be some questions for you.